Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Low Carb Lifestyle Podcast. Today, I am super excited to have chatting with me Angela Stanton, Dr. Angela Stanton. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm totally humbled and honored. Thank you.
No, definitely me. As I said to you before we started recording, definitely a fangirl moment meeting you. I've definitely followed your work for quite some time, particularly the start of last year. I actually had a client who had been suffering migraines for a very long time. So I did a bit of research and, of course, came across your fabulous. Yes, it is such an incredible book. If anyone listening is a migraine sufferer, I highly recommend the book, and obviously following the work that you do. I think it's just such a beacon of light in such an area where there's just so much misinformation, but also lack of hope for people. And does that sound like what it was like for you until you cracked the code?
Oh, completely. That's probably why, out of my just sheer determination that I can't lose, that I went after trying to crack the code. I didn't think I would crack the code. I just simply wanted a solution. And then in the process of me trying out different things, it just happened, together with, of course, reading tons of documents and papers and books and everything. But it just sort of, I would have to say it was quite a serendipitous kind of an experiment based on the many articles I read. Well, saying to myself, well, it's got to be this, it's got to be that, it's got to be this. Well, they tell you this, they tell you that. And so you kind of try everything that there is. Of course, the medications, none of them really works. Some works maybe for some time, but then they don't. And then there are, of course, the typical things. Take magnesium, take B2, take God knows what. And so you try all these things and then nothing is working. But when I tried something that nobody that I could see recommended, which was salt, and that worked. And I said, well, okay, why is this? And so then I started to connect the dots while continuing to take the salt. So at that time, I was just taking in the morning, woke up, I would take a pinch of salt. And I remember my mother was very ill, and we had a nurse in the house all the time, and she would be laughing on me because the first thing she would see me do is had to, salt was in a container like sugar for other people. And in fact, in some times it was even mistaken for sugar. And then friends would come over and my husband would serve sugar for the coffee and they turned it to salt. and I would just pop salt in and water, and she would just get a kick out of doing this. And she herself was a migraine nurse, so she started doing it. Sure enough, it worked for her too. So it's kind of blossomed into a protocol over the years of my guinea pig experimentation of N=1 and all the articles reading. And then finally, I would say about 2 years into, before I published the first book, the one that you have in your hand is my second book. The first book was about me. And so about 2 years prior to the first book, I started to find a couple of articles that I could say, aha, so this was my thought. And interestingly, some of those articles were from the 1950s, 1960s. So there was some research that were non-medicinal, just to understand it, but not too many. And so it was completely by accident that I sort of kind of came up on a solution and then stumbled onto sort of like a confirmation bias. Hey, this is what I've been doing, and it's telling me that this would have been a good idea. And then it sort of kind of moved on from there.
So are you kind of saying that, if someone listening is suffering from migraines, that salt obviously is a big part of the puzzle, but it can't be all the puzzle. Surely there'd be other factors at play?
Right. A lot of other factors apply, but salt is a primary. So I would say that just salt alone solves probably about 50-60% of the problem.
That's amazing.
That's really amazing.
Of course, you and I both know, being in the space now for so long, how essential salt is. And yet we are continually told to reduce our salt intake, now it's, well, we do it for metabolic health. We know salt's really good for that. But, to hear that 50% to 60% of migraines could be eased just by having salt.
Right.
Why are we not getting this information? What's going on?
Well, two things are going on. One, of course, is that the pharmaceutical industry has no interest in a solution such as salt. I mean, who makes money on salt? I don't make money on you taking salt. So I clearly don't benefit telling you. Nobody benefits from telling you that the salt would help, right? So it isn't in anybody's particular interest unless it's some kind of a volunteer or donation or some kind of a nonprofit setting, which is what I am. And so this is point number one. Point number two is that to understand migraine, many people, I'm sure, many of the pharmaceuticals actually understand migraine. I mean, if you go to genecards.org, which is a human genome database, and you put in migraine, you're going to get over 3,000 variants by now. But what's interesting is that the first 3 or 4 are unchanged over the past 8 years. They're always been and always are channelopathy. And so there are a couple of articles out there that tells you that migraine is a channelopathy, which is an ionic channel disorder. It's a variant of the ionic channel. Of course, just because it's a variant, it doesn't mean that it's expressed, or you don't know whether it's a variant meaning too active or underactive, or what the problem is with it, or what's different. And so it's not telling you that. But everybody knows it's a channelopathy, because if you look at the medications, every single one of them is working on ionic channels. So the pharmaceutical industry understands that it's an ionic channel problem. But what to do with the genetic ionic channel problem is not a question. And so it could be that the ionic channel works in such a way that it's overly working. So then you would need to reduce, for example, salt or calcium or potassium. These are the 3 ionic channels that are variants in a migraine brain. Or maybe they all 3 are underactive, so you need to increase all 3. Or maybe some are underactive, some are overactive. So which way is it not working? And why is it that way? And how important is that? And what actually drives the importance of an ionic channel? How come that is important for me and it's not important for somebody else? Because everybody has some variants somewhere, not just migraineurs. Epilepsy is also an ionic channel variant.
So when you say ionic channel, are you talking about just the pathways, but that cross into the brain, or can you explain?
No, it's inside the brain. It's in the neurons. It's actually
Okay.
the neurons themselves. So in the neurons, and it's rather complicated, and sorry for those of you who are not very familiar, I'm trying to simplify it. But so think of a neuron as basically a tube, okay, with a head and then little feet and tail. That's where the neurotransmitters come out of. But in between, there's a line, which is called the axon. And so think of it as a rope. And as there's a rope, it is coated with myelin, which is the insulation. It's made out of cholesterol and fat. Mm-hmm. But in between, it looks like sort of kind of sausage. So there are little spaces between the way that it's connected. So it's not a solid line, but it's like a little sausage. So it's kind of sort of connected this way. And so in between, where there are sausages ended, that area of the neuron is not covered with myelin. So it's not insulated. And that is the area, because if you look at say a toaster and you've got an electric cord, it's fully insulated, but it's electrons that move in that cord from one end to the other. But in the neuron, we are not plugged into the electricity. We are recreating that voltage by sodium entering the cell and potassium leaving the cell. And then the electricity stops by potassium entering in the cell and sodium leaving the cell. So this movement has to be made possible. And so this movement is made possible in the areas where there's no insulation. And so these are really and there are maybe millions of these along the neuron, depending on the size of the length of this axon, or it could be just a few, because we have very little neurons and very big neurons. So like the biggest one is 3 feet or more, going from our lower back to the toe. And so we can have different sizes of neurons, but they all work with electrical communication. And this communication, we call communication, but they don't talk. They chatter with neurotransmitters being sent left and right, but they have to kick the neurotransmitters out. And that is an information packet of chemistry. And in order for that packet to reach the end at the feet, at the boutons, where you've got the neurotransmitters leaving into the gap between 2 neurons for communication, that entire activity is this voltage. Now imagine we have millions of these little open areas. What's in these open areas? So in these open areas, we have sodium channels, potassium channels, sodium, potassium, ATPase channels, which are doing both, magnesium, calcium, whatever. We have all kinds of these ionic channels. And so for each voltage start, one of these channels has to allow all sodiums to run into the cells, all across this one place around the neuron in this one gap. And there may be just a few to thousands of sodium channels. So it has to be able to get in. Then when the voltage started, it moves to the next open area where, again, sodium channels must open just at the right time to carry that voltage to the next one. So that is often described as a voltage hopping, and it's called the spike train because of the voltage sort of kind of hopping. It's not hopping, it doesn't leave the axon, but it's just a very good way of representing how the voltage goes, basically really recreated at every single entry into the axon through these little areas, the nodes of MBA, where there's no myelination. Now imagine one area where there's no sodium.
Yeah.
What happens?
Mm.
Voltage just stops.
It derails.
Right there. Exactly. There's no more. It can't continue. And so this is the problem, that if there's no proper sodium distribution all through the neuron where there's this communication going on, and of course we have millions of neurons in the brain, it could be anywhere, right? But if just, and I don't know what the minimum threshold is, because there is an action potential level that has to be, the voltage has to reach a certain level in order for it to become an action potential, because otherwise it still kind of sort of starts, but it stops. So there could be failed action potential. So it's always called as the all or nothing action potential. So in order for the action potential, you have to have a certain minimum threshold number of sodium channels working. And if that is not reached, that you can't start voltage. And if you can't start voltage, that neuron is not communicating. And that's the start of the migraine.
Wow. So I suppose like many, processes in the body, there's an element, or when it doesn't go right, there's an element of a genetic component, combined with a lifestyle. Is that what is that your experience around migraines as well?
Well, migraine is exclusively genetic. So you may have a very big headache, but it may not be a migraine
did you
at
say
all.
Exclusively genetic?
Right.
Really?
Right.
Okay.
So you can't have a migraine. You may have a very big headache, but you can't have a migraine without genetic setup for it. And a headache is not even required for a migraine, right? So we can have oral migraine, which are silent migraines. So you need not have a headache associated with it. So a headache is not even by any means a description or definition of a migraine. So it just oftentimes comes with a headache, but not always. And it's a very different kind of headache too, because as I've just explained with a neuron, the brain has two hemispheres, two very distinct hemispheres, which are separate. And in the two hemispheres, neurons don't just crisscross. They don't. There's a distinct separation between them. And so a migraine headache, by definition, is only on one side of the head, not on both. So if you have a headache, no matter how big it is, if it's not on one side of the head, it's not a migraine.
Wow, that's fascinating. I remember as a teenager, I had what I would have called migraines. Now, I'm not sure, but it was very, it was very much linked to my menstrual cycle. I would get these incredible, like my mom had to give me this medication to knock me out because I was just in so much pain with them. And I eventually just grew out of them. Is it likely that it probably wasn't a migraine, or is there some sort of hormonal?
There can be cases where migraine is sort of outgrown. For example, males have predominantly their migraines. There are some men who carry on being migraines, but predominantly it disappears after puberty. So there are times the hormonal changes when things can turn on or off or switched on and off, expressed on and off in the genetic terms. So it is possible that somebody can pick up migraine genes at any time and then turn them off later in their life and then turn them back on again. So these things have happened in not just migraine, but in other things as well. And we also have a lot of different nutritional methods today that we know. For example, ketosis itself can express certain different genes from what you had before ketosis. So we know that there are some nutritional factors in whether a gene is expressed or not, and when it is expressed and how it is expressed. So it is entirely possible that you could have had migraines and then they disappeared and they may come back later. I find in my migraine group on Facebook, which is now, I have two, but one of them is the main group, has over 11,000 members. And the majority of the people start migraine later in their years. So it isn't necessarily something you have to be born with. It can express anytime. And there are some people who used to have a lot of migraines and now it's kind of reducing. And as your brain is changing, it can also be that, unfortunately, that's not necessarily good news when they say, well, by the time you are postmenopausal, your migraines will disappear, because in order for it to happen, you need to have some brain degeneration. Because part of the problem that we haven't yet talked about, which is also genetic, is that the migraine brain, the sensory organs within sensory neurons in the migraine brain are more sensitized. And they are so because there are more connections among them. There are some studies that show that in a migraine brain, the sensory neurons have much more connections. And so there's more chatter between sensory neurons in the migraine brain. This means that the more chatter, more communications, if this reduces over time and you stop being so sensitive to odors or light or sounds, and therefore by age 60, 70, you kind of lose your migraines, this would mean a degenerated brain that stops these connections. So it isn't necessarily a good thing if you lose your migraines. And so I'm actually quite happy because I'm 68 and I still have migraines. So I'm actually happy because that means my brain hasn't degenerated yet. So I'm doing everything possible to maintain my migraine status quo as it goes without actually having migraines by simply seeing my prodromes. But back to your periods in your childhood, migraines, if they are migraines, whether they come with pain or not, they must have prodromes. So a migraine has 3 stages. There's a prodrome, which is a period that can be up to 2 days long before a migraine. Then there's the actual migraine, which is a minimum, as per definition of the American Headache Association, has to be minimum 4 hours. Generally speaking, I would say most migraineurs has it more than a day. I personally used to have it for 3 days and often 5. And then it will be preceded by a post-drome. So you have 3 very separate phases. And if you lack the prodrome, you may not have migraines. But finding the prodromes is very difficult because when you're hurting, you can't really tell, well, did I have a prodrome? Did I catch a prodrome? What are my prodromes? I don't know, because nobody tells you, well, these are the prodromes that you should be keeping an eye out for. So in my group, with all the migraineurs in there, we ran surveys of the different kind of prodromes. So we now know that there are literally hundreds of prodromes. So it's nearly impossible for you to, without first understanding what your normal prodromes are. Once you've discovered a few, then you will know, okay, so at least I have a few. So I know what to look out for. Those seem to be my most typical prodromes. And then once you understand those, you can identify your migraines. Because other than you just wake up with a migraine, okay, was it migraine or do I just have a headache? You just don't know.
Yeah, right. But obviously the more, aware you are of all of those, and then you can preempt, as you say, like it could be 2 days, 3 days before you actually get the migraine. But just very interesting what you were saying. I mean, obviously, never even sort of entered my mind that it would be a good thing to keep these things happening in terms of, brain function. And, I think that's fascinating. But obviously then the flip side of that is that obviously you don't want to be going, if you can become aware of when they're coming, there must be things that you can do to sort of mitigate the agony associated with them.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
actually many people I talk to in my migraine group, I say, well, I don't want to have my prodromes. I say, well, no, you do want to have your prodromes because that helps you learn that, okay, I'm about to come down with a migraine and I now can work on it. And so some of the prodromes that are most common, nearly all migraineurs have one eye becoming smaller than the other. Now we all have some asymmetries, but
Yeah.
you kind of have to know your face. And so I help every migraineur, I tell them also in the book to take selfies, take a look at your face, but always in the same angle, same kind of light as much as possible, and right on and look into the camera and compare them just throughout the day. Take 15, 20 selfies for several days in a row for a week, for example, or if you're still menstruating, them for a month. And take a look at changes of your faces and repeat it the next time. And also take diary notes to see, well, on this day, this, and you can attach the photo to the diary. I think there are some such apps and you can take a look at it. And you have the notes that will tell you what you felt and what you did, what you ate, what you drank, what kind of stresses you have faced, menstrual period, etc. And then once you are aware of these, then you can recognize certain prodrome face symptoms. So face symptoms are, for example, one eye being smaller. Some
Are
people
you
get,
looking at the whole eye, or are you just looking at
you're
the
looking at the whole
pupil?
eye, not the
Really?
pupil. It's the whole, like I usually have this eye become much smaller. I mean, this is usually a tiny bit always smaller than my other one by now. But if I really, truly, fully salt up the proper way, then this eye will become totally the same size, and you can't tell them apart. But if I start getting a migraine, then I'm going to end up looking like this, sort of kind of barely able to open the
Okay.
eye. So there's going to be a
Right.
huge difference. And I didn't know
Mm.
that. My husband told me, you have a migraine eye or migraine face, he said. I said, what's a migraine face? And slowly we discovered it was my eye. Some people have a little lip problem. Some people have huge edema starting over one eye in particular, the eye over the eyelid area. Sometimes bags under the two eyes will differ significantly. Other kind of symptoms for like yawning is a very typical symptoms when you start yawning in the middle of the day without feeling tired. I had a migraine a couple of years ago. It was really funny. She said, I felt so good last night. I was cleaning the kitchen at 10 p.m., tip to toe, scrubbing everything, and bang, this morning migraine. Wow. Is it normal for you to scrub your kitchen at 10 p.m. at night? So there are some good things that you think that you're doing really good, right? And then you're hit with a migraine. Or like for me, I may watch a commercial and start crying. I said, uh-oh, that's a prodrome. I'm too emotional.
Interesting.
So there are
Wow.
some very subtle signs, and then there are some very strong signs. Like I'm hemiplegic migraine, not always, but I had a couple of them. Well, for example, my right arm is going to go start buzzing and vibrating, and I'm kind of sort of losing control. So that would be another one. For a real hemiplegic, it may be the whole half body that just simply goes numb and they can't even stand. Of course, there's the aura. Like I also have what is not really referred to an aura, but I still call them auras. And we by now have listed some, I think, 34 different kind of aura types. Mine, a couple of them that are really interesting, like in the middle of the night, I will suddenly wake up as if somebody just lit the brightest flashlight in one eye. It's like, whoa. And
Wow.
that's a prodrome. But I can also have these beautiful, like fireworks, the blue things, spots and dots coming toward me. And I just watch and enjoy. It's just a beautiful sight. And then I salt because I know that I'm having a prodrome and then it's over. So, yeah, so there are a
Wow.
lot of different prodromes. You just have to kind of sort of understand them.
Yeah, so obviously that's a big part of the work that you do, getting people to become really aware of their individual ones, because
Right.
it sounds like they're going to be, and unless you
Right.
actually track it over a certain period of time, it would be so easy to miss, I would
Very
imagine.
easy. Yeah, very easy
Yeah.
to miss. And they also change.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
and
Right.
that's another problem. So you have to kind of keep an eye out for, okay, this is different from what I'm used to. What is this? What did just happen? And then you can take a look and see, does it repeat? Is it followed by a migraine or by other prodromes? Prodromes don't necessarily come alone either. Like another typical prodrome is sudden urination with no
Hmm.
yellow color in the urine is just pure. That just simply means you're out of electrolyte balance and your kidneys are washing out the excess of whether it's sodium or potassium. It's just washing out, or water, just washing out the excess. And so excess urination is a sign. So you have a lot of little things kind of sort of pile up, and you can, at the beginning, it's difficult because you're typically too late to act on it. But as you get more and more into it, you can avert all your migraines. So I haven't had a migraine. I just had COVID. I'm just coming through COVID. And
really?
yeah, and I didn't get a single migraine all through. So
how fantastic. That's great. That's great. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I don't know if I read it in your book or I heard you talk about it somewhere, and maybe I dreamt it. I'm not sure. But it's definitely salt. So, sodium. It's not made up. Did I read somewhere about not taking potassium and magnesium with the sodium? Is that correct?
Right. Actually, you don't want to take potassium at all, ever. In a supplemental form, because it goes in a different place. In my new book that I'm working on, which I don't really have time to write, so I don't know when it's going to be born, but I'm going to spend an entire chapter explaining the difference between eating salt and potassium with food versus taking it in water. So there is a different point of entry in terms of into your circulatory system. So when you take salt, you put salt into the water, it immediately becomes electrolyte. So the salt, sodium chloride, they break up, they connect to hydrogen and oxygen, which the water is polar. It will connect immediately. It will break everything up you put into it. And so it becomes the official electrolyte is one that is able to carry a current. And so salt put into the water immediately becomes an electrolyte, but you put the salt into food, it won't. At that point, then the different chemical elements will still break up, but they can form different bonds. So for example, eating salt with your steak and fat will have a lot of hydrogen and a lot of chloride. And what is that? That's your stomach acid. So then you're creating stomach acid, for example. So the chloride is no longer heading up into the brain to balance the sodium for the exchanges. There are different roles for everything. And so depending on how you take it, potassium, if you take it in water together with sodium, it's going to become electrolyte. That means it heads straight to your blood. But take a look at the blood test next time when you go to get an electrolyte panel. Check how much sodium and how much potassium you're supposed to have in your blood. You're supposed to have this little potassium and 30 times as much sodium. So if you take potassium of any amount, if you're not taking 30 times that much sodium, you're completely knocking yourself out of electrolyte balance. And your kidneys are immediately going to remove the excess potassium if you're healthy. If you're not healthy, they may give you heart palpitations, all kinds of problems. So taking potassium as a supplement is really difficult. I wrote an article on it, which is found at Hormones Matter. It's a website where I publish. It's a scientific blog. And in that, I interviewed an ER cardiologist surgeon about supplementing potassium, because I asked him, well, do you supplement potassium to heart patients who come in to the emergency room? And he said, no, because in order for us to take the excess potassium can't from the blood go into the cell. Because in order for potassium to go, we have to remember that potassium and sodium both are electrically charged ions, right? Both are positive, they repel each other. And so they can't be in the same place at the same time. And one of them will have to leave. But the cells themselves, they are filled with potassium. They have more potassium inside, but have very little sodium outside. And the blood will now have about the same or more potassium. I don't know whoever is taking. That excess potassium has to reduce to 1/30th of what the sodium is. So it has to go somewhere. And so, but it cannot enter the cell unless sodium expels from the cell. There's an exchange movement.
Right.
And to get sodium out of the cell, so if, for example, you're an athlete and you have a lot of hyperkalemia, that's a very typical athletic problem, and you end up in the emergency semi-unconscious, what they actually have to do with you is add glucose and insulin into your blood to get the potassium out of your blood. because what glucose does in our blood, we have glucose taken out by sodium transporters, not by insulin. Sodium transporters. Most of the time is sodium transporters. And as the glucose enters the cells, it kicks out sodium. This is the only time that potassium can enter the cells.
Wow, because that's really interesting. First of all, can I please? Are you able to share the links to what you've written?
Oh yeah, I can share.
I'd love
absolutely
to share that,
right,
and
sure.
read. But also because there's such a, certainly in the space at the moment, these big electrolyte drinks at the moment, which have a combination of all three, sodium, potassium, and magnesium, and
right.
That's interesting what you're saying. Then it's probably not optimal necessarily to have a drink with all three at once.
Not only not optimal with these three, but also magnesium, and I haven't brought this one up yet. So everybody considers magnesium to be a very perfect, relaxing element, but for a migraineur, it's actually excitatory. So if we take magnesium at night, we are going to have vivid dreams, insomnia, amazing REM sleeps, nightmares, you name it.
And yet it's pushed a lot as a nighttime thing.
Well, it may work that way for other people, but it certainly doesn't work for migraineurs, because if you look at the function of magnesium in the brain, with the ionic channels, in order for sodium to enter the cell through the sodium potassium ATPase, which is the one that balances the membrane potential for the cells so that the next action potential can be initiated. That itself has the ATPase. The ATP is an energy unit that's connecting to magnesium in order to open the gate so sodium can come in, or sodium can leave and potassium can come in. So these are the two things that it does. Magnesium keeps on opening this thing to open the pump so that sodium and potassium can go. You don't want sodium and potassium to continuously go, because then you're going to have a lot more chatter.
Wow, that's fascinating. So overall, it sounds like, sodium is obviously the one that is, the essential one. And then, if you, I suppose it would get very, individualized as to whether you would need, any other supplements after that. But if you're getting the sodium right, then you're eating a balanced diet, and you've looked at all the other little little triggers and stuff like that. I know, okay, you can't give a general advice or a specific advice, but is that sort of what you're saying, that you focus mainly on getting in enough sodium, and it needs to be more in a drink than just on your food?
Well, there's more to that, because in the drink, we drink, I don't remember the last time I had a glass of water without salt added to it.
Yeah.
It's just like every single glass of water will get salt to it.
And can I just interrupt you there, because there's a huge debate too. Is it specific salt, or is it just table salt? Is there a halo of salts we need to be aware of?
Right. So this is a personal opinion based on my understanding of what salt is. And I understand that there are different opinions, but because we eat so much salt, migraineurs eat a lot more salt than other people do. So for us, eating salts that will have other minerals in them, such as lead, mercury, arsenic, radioactive stuff like in the Himalayan salt, also organic materials from dead creatures in the ocean deposited over millions of years and ending up as rock salt. If you just eat it as a decor, no problem. Time to time you can have it. But if you eat as much salt as we do, I eat 4 to 5 times the RDA in salt a day. For me, it is important that I don't eat all these elements that I really shouldn't be having in my body. But I do want iodine. And so I recommend for everyone who doesn't have Hashimoto's or Graves' disease to have iodized table salt. And what we find out with this is that I would say about 60-70%, and this is not based on tests, just an estimation, of the migraineurs who come into my Facebook migraine group have some kind of thyroid disturbance, usually hypothyroid, not necessarily autoimmune Hashimoto, but just regular hypothyroid. When they start the nutrition that we use and the iodized salt, they all get cured, and they're all coming off of their medications one after the other. they don't need it anymore. And so I recommend iodized salt. And nobody so far had any. I think one person commented that she gets thirsty from iodine. She didn't take it. And I said, that was weird. I haven't heard, but okay. But everybody else takes, and if not iodized salt, they prefer the taste of the non-iodine. Then they take iodine supplements, kelp, that kind of things. And so I recommend just the cheapest table salt. There's no need for anything fancy. Sure, I will eat some decor like black salt I had 2 days ago. That was fantastic. I never had it before. It was super. Until I found out it was colored black with activated charcoal, which people take for stomach problems. I said, okay, maybe not. So I don't know. But I imagine that for certain special foods under special conditions a few times, of course, no problem, but not 10 times a day. No.
Yeah. And then even interesting when you said not for people with Hashimoto's, because I've got Hashimoto's in remission at the moment, but I was told so many different things around whether I should be taking iodized salt or I shouldn't. You know, I mean, in the end, I didn't. And, you know, things have sort of righted itself. But what would be the reasoning behind if you actually have Hashimoto's not taking the iodine?
Well, again, like you said it correctly, it depends on who you talk to and what you see. What I see so far is that what I learned is that Hashimoto was considered to be an iodine allergy. But then without iodine, the thyroid doesn't work. And the medications that people get for thyroid, Hashimoto thyroid, has iodine in it. So it just didn't make any sense to me. And if you listen to some other videos, such as Dr. Canberry and others, they will say, yes, you need to have iodine even if you have Hashimoto's. And on the flip side, I had two people in my migraine groups, my 2 migraine groups, who had Hashimoto's that reversed. And so I don't know what to suggest. I'm not really, I think that because Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease, when you change your diet and you remove everything that could be causing, and we can talk about this, and this is also plants, not necessarily just the bad stuff, but even vegetables and plants. Once you remove those and your body returns to an uninflamed, normal self, then some of your autoimmune conditions disappear, and Hashimoto's is likely to also disappear.
Well, that's what I experienced, definitely. And I'm, you know, definitely talked about it before on my podcast, being taking all that out, going carnivore 6 months, and I'm pretty much predominantly carnivore now. I mean, I've never, apart from when I was a teenager, like I said, with migraines, I don't suffer migraines now, thankfully, but yeah, it certainly works for me. And, you know, there's obviously some science behind it, you know, with the anti-nutrients in plants. And, you know, do you find that with your migraine sufferers and people that you work with, that it helps with migraines as well?
Oh, absolutely. So you mean the reduction of plants? Is that what you mean? Or the reduction of plants? Yes. Yeah. And the biggest reason that I find is that it's very difficult for a migraineur to control carbohydrates. And we haven't talked about this particular sentence that I keep on bringing up at every interview, is that glucose entering the cells kicks out sodium and water. And we talked about earlier that if you have too much potassium in your blood, then they give you insulin and glucose, because that's the only way that potassium can go into the cell, because sodium and water leave. And so if I'm eating carbohydrate and my sodium leaves the cell, I'm actually creating a migraine right there. And so it is important for me to not do that. Yeah. And so if I cut, now let's go to the carnivore. Carnivore diet is not carbs free. I went the other day, actually yesterday, for Valentine's Day dinner. And I ate myself to death on oysters. And then I don't know if you've entered oysters into the USDA database to see, I ate more carbohydrates than if I had a slice of cake. Yeah. And so you can eat plenty of carbohydrates. And even in a steak, you have glycogen and you have plenty of glucose. So your life is not glucose free on the carnivore diet, but it's plant free. So you're not eating any anti-nutrients. And so there's a difference right there. And in terms of migraineurs, I find that the anti-nutrients have a lot of problems with them because of the autoimmune diseases that they can be causing. And the autoimmune diseases then create an inflamed body, which then responds differently to its circumstances. And that's when you get confused and you can't even tell your prodromes or a headache from a migraine, because your body is giving you mixed signals. So it is better for you to remove all those external sources of irritation so you can tell what you're doing. And many of my migraineurs start with a carnivore diet also because they're so sensitive to carbohydrates, because of the fact that sodium gets to be expelled by glucose entering the cells, that they can't even eat it, because I've run what's called a Kraft test in situ equivalent. So I don't run his test. His test was a 5-hour test, postprandial taken by every hour with insulin and blood glucose. I can't take insulin, so I take blood glucose and blood ketones, where I use ketones for insulin proxy. And instead of every hour, I take it every half hour. So we have a very close looking at the blood glucose and ketones in parallel, and then I can estimate the insulin from that. And I find that when they join the group, they're very much metabolically unhealthy, even if they were never diagnosed as such. But I can clearly show huge sugar crashes. They have no idea because they don't feel it, but they have sugar crashes. And so we remove them from carbohydrates. We, meaning me, and I have a few administrators who also volunteer their times. And so we remove them from carbohydrates and move them on to the carnivore diet. And we find their blood glucose and ketones just even out beautifully. Not for all, some of them takes 2 years, but for some, within a couple of weeks, it's just normal. And then at that point, they stop having migraines. They have the salt, as we recommend that they take the salt. They balance the nutrition and they remove the external glucose sources. And the body is only going to create as much glucose as it needs and not more. And so then they won't have any issues anymore, and they won't run out of sodium in their brain. No more migraines.
Sounds so simple, doesn't it? But of course, we know, making any dietary changes is never, it comes with all its challenges. Obviously getting the support people need. If anyone's listening to this, you've got obviously groups and support plus your book, because, there's not enough people that know about this stuff. And, I think when there's such a potential to really manage something that is just, but it's just terrible, for people that do experience it. I think I'd love to kind of wrap up this, because I really want to ask you about the Mediterranean diet as well. But to wrap up some migraines, just, for someone sitting there listening, most the podcast is the low carb lifestyle podcast. Most people listening are, understand the carb side of things. But, if people are still experiencing migraines and they've reduced their carbohydrates, what would be some of the big, apart from what you've said, the sodium and the other things? How would you start?
I definitely would first start with increasing their water amount that they drink a day, because we are taught that whatever water you take from the food and coffee and tea and other things, they count, but they don't count. So if you look at the chemical aspect of it, you can't separate water from coffee for the life of you. You have to heat it, boil it, evaporate it. There's no fire in your body. It just doesn't happen that simply. There's a chemical bonds that you have to break. And yes, we do have an atomic power plant in here, and we do bake up a lot of things, but it isn't that simple. It's not necessarily that available. It's a different chemical amount. It will connect to different things. So your body needs water. Drink water, just water with salt.
But with salt?
With salt, yes. And I recommend 1/8 of a teaspoon salt. Again, it's not a medical recommendation. That is what most of the migraineurs do in my migraine group, but some of us do more, like my doctor, who's a cardiologist. I used to have arrhythmia, which I no longer do. And he just told me, just double that. Because if you go to the emergency room, you're getting the saline intravenous solution. That is 3/8 of a teaspoon, more than 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt per 8 ounce of cup of water. And that's considered healthy. Well, that's like 10 times the RDA.
Yeah. Wow.
So there's really no restriction need for those who truly understand the system. Anyway, so aside from this, it is very important for migraineurs to understand that salt doesn't increase blood pressure if it's taken in a proper amount of water. So they need to increase the water And I use for that a standard dietitian or nutritionist calculator of 55% of the weight in ounces of water. So if somebody weighs 100 pounds, then it would be 100 ounces would be the maximum. 55 ounces of water would be the minimum daily need for a woman. For men, it's 70 ounces. They're 75%. And so once they increase the water to the right amount, then they also salt their water the right way and cut their carbs back the proper way, and don't add sweeteners, not even stevia or any other kind of sweeteners. Don't go for these fats of the almond flour or any of these kind of things. Just eat healthy, whole foods that you can make yourself. And if you do that and you increase your water salt, you will be migraine free. But you have to maintain it. But migraine pain is so strong that it's a very strong inspiring. And so I don't find that a lot of people leave the effort because they get so much relief. They say, well, this is worth any migraine-free day in my life.
Amazing. Do you find dairy can be,
We drink it. Migraineurs are very strong dairy drinkers. So unlike other people outside of the migraine world, most of them are lactose intolerant. Migraineurs seem to be nearly all lactose tolerant. We love dairy. We eat dairy day and night.
Interesting. Okay. Oh, right. Okay.
We are the little green people from the planet Mars.
Oh, that's funny. Well, it just keeps going. You know, the more people I talk to, and the more different spaces. And I've just finished doing Dr. Georgia Eads' course.
Oh, love her.
It was just fabulous. But of course, dairy is something for people with mental health issues that may be an issue. Sorry. So it's going to come back to what are the individual issues
it's
that
individual.
People are dealing with.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So you recently, Angela, wrote a fantastic article, which I shared far and wide, around the Mediterranean diet and the myth, I guess, surrounding it. And I think it's something that I'd love to talk to you about, because I think it is just growing in popularity as being the overall healthy diet, this Mediterranean diet.
Right.
And I'm going to link the article below for people to who haven't seen it to read it, but. I'd just love to get your view really on why is the Mediterranean diet that we see it not the Mediterranean diet as we should see it.
Yeah, so actually it was the article that I wrote that brought us together, right? So
yes.
it's fascinating because I have family in the Mediterranean. And I spent my summers as a child in that part of the world. And also I am from Europe. And so I know what we ate in Europe when I grew up. And of course, I grew up in the 50s. So we're talking about the era prior to Ansel Keys, actually pretty much the time that he was doing his research. And it was interesting to see that what he found in his research is like 180 degrees of what we actually ate. So I have no idea what he did. And this little video that one of my migraineurs sent to me about this nutritionist who went to Icaria, to one of the Greek islands, where I haven't been, by the way, which is part of the Blue Zones. And so the Blue Zones is the original Mediterranean way of eating. And so she went to this Icariani, can I pronounce it, island, to find out what people ate there, to see if that aligned with what she was told in her classes and books and the Mediterranean diet and the blue books. And she discovered none of that was true, but she discovered why it wasn't true. And you may recall that nearly 95% of all nutritional research is done by questionnaires, food questionnaires. And they ask you, well, how many cups of burgers you ate? I'm not kidding. It's in cups. Don't even ask me how to measure your burgers in cups or stuff like that. But so these are all asked in weird measurements, but foods that were not common at that time in the United States were not on the menu. They were not on these lists, such as, for example, goat, lamb, sheep, the dairy, the lamb meat, the cheeses, none of these was on the survey. And so people couldn't choose them, even if that is what they ate. This is not, if it's not on the survey, and you have to pick the foods that you ate. And of course, you have to remember what you ate for the past 5 years. So I mean, some of the surveys go back 20 years. I mean, I couldn't recall what I ate 2 days ago, let alone 20 years ago. I mean, I have no idea what I ate last year, even though I was at home locked up on COVID, right? So the surveys are really inaccurate, not just because they don't contain the proper foods listed, but also because they categorize. So for example, they tell you how much red meat you ate. Okay, red meat. But what kind of red meat? Is this in salami? Is this in bacon? Or is this actually a slice of steak that you just freshly gathered from your own cow? I mean, there are obviously differences in the nutrient values, but these questionnaires are not looking at that. And they also omit a lot of other kind of nutrients that aren't considered at all. And then they omit things such as smoking or alcohol or activities and exercise, family closeness, all kinds of factors that are associated with health and longevity. They're excluded. And on top of that, when Ansel Keys went there to do the original studies, he went there during Lent, which in the Greek religious time is a whole month without eating meat, right? They have to give up one food. And so he was there when they didn't eat meat. But that month was not typical for Greece, but he took that to be typical. And so not that he wasn't eating meat. Apparently he was eating meat, but he just considered meat to be unhealthy for others. And also the original study that he did, I think at 22 or 27 countries, I don't remember how many countries he originally had on the studies, but in the study that he included in the research work, he only selected 7. So it's considered to be a 7-country study. And the 7 that he selected all lined up with his hypothesis, which was obviously a cognitive bias selection. And the countries that didn't line up, he just simply excluded. So for example, France, this is where the term French paradox comes from, because he couldn't explain how come the French ate so much saturated fat and so much red meat, and they didn't have the cardiovascular disease and the LDL issues and the heart issues and the cancer issues and other kind of issues. And so he just simply excluded them. So I can't figure it out. So it's just so it's basically fraudulent science. That's basically what it is. And so unfortunately, we have a financial movement of the plant-based agenda. And this is a big problem because we have a whole lot of financiers behind it who make billions of dollars on the vulnerable. And there's also the movement, of course, for the climate change, which that too is misguided, because actually tilling the earth releases a lot more CO2 than all the cows put together. So it really is a major problem that there's a deliberateness in misinformation. And there isn't much we can do about it because there's a very large population, and some of these studies come from well-known papers. And so I often get the message, well, I need to have root cause academic, peer-reviewed academic journal. Well, I was a peer reviewer in academic journals. Ask me how many journals I rejected got published.
How many?
100%.
Really?
I regularly rejected about 90% of the articles that came to me because the statistics was either the wrong statistics was used, or the right statistic was used but the wrong way, or was completely misinterpreted. And I noted that, but there are 3 reviewers minimum, and the 2 that agrees that it's going to be published. And I have not been able to turn a single one away, no matter what.
Wow. That's stuff people just need to know, but it's very difficult to get that out, isn't it? You know,
you can't. You can. And the only way I can tell you this, because I left academia, because I found it to be too corrupt to be part of it.
Oh, gosh. Wow. Well, you know, this is what, you know, I suppose drives, you know, us to keep doing what we're doing and showing people that there are options. And, you know, I think it is very worrying, because I think there is so much money behind it. And of course, this Mediterranean diet. Now people think of it as a plant-based diet, and you're so right. I mean, I'm married to a Greek. We've been to Greece regularly, and you tell a Greek that they, it's just like, you're kidding, aren't you?
Right. They don't even have plants. I mean, I spent my entire childhood. I left my country when I was 21 in Europe, and I didn't see salad until I arrived to the American continent. I didn't know what it was. I mean, it was just not something that we ate.
Whereabouts were you from? Where was it?
I'm from Hungary. I'm from Hungary.
Okay. Because that was interesting what you were saying in the article too, that, most people think of vegetables as actually something that's a fruit. There was olives and, tomatoes and things like that, which,
It's not true. But also, if you look back the history of vegetables, it's very interesting to find. I have people telling me, but tomatoes and legumes have always been part of our history. I said, yeah, right. They didn't even exist in your country until 1600. And some of them, like legumes, even later. So we can't even say, I mean, even just think back nectarine. Do you recall the first time you had nectarine? Do you know when that was developed? I was about 10, I think, when the first nectarine was created, engineered. It didn't exist. So I would say that about 80% potatoes were not part of Europe until 1600. It didn't exist on this continent. It comes from South America. So if you're looking at all these kind of vegetables, where did these come from? And where did they come from prior to transportation and refrigeration and houses? How did we have in Sweden tomatoes in the middle of winter? We didn't. It just wasn't there.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, that's like anything. You scratch the surface a little bit,
right,
and it does start to fall away. But, people just they've got to start scratching the surface. And, thank you for doing what you do and sharing what you do. And I know you're a big part of the Nutrition Network as well, who I love and adore. And you've been you're a lecturer within their neurology program, is that right? So that's all around migraines, or?
It's all around migraines. It's 3 hours. So it's the heart of the neurology section. It's 3 full hours. So it's quite hard. And actually the first one I'm saying really quickly, because it should really have been much longer than 1 hour, but I had a limited window. And I have another lecture that was Nutrition Coalition in the United Kingdom. So they also have, it's also for nutritionists. So there are a couple of lectures around. And of course, the World Summit is coming up. So I will be on that one next month.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to have links to everything below for people to connect with you and to learn more about your awesome work. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you. I could have just chatted to you all day, but again, here is the second book of Angela's. And if you are a migraine sufferer or you know someone who is, get your hands on it because it could change your life. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's really been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.